Greetings and welcome to the Bible Paladin. Thank you for joining me and know that you are appreciated. We will be starting in the beginning.
Well, if you start at the beginning, that's always a good place.
Which of course are the first words of the book of Genesis. But before we embark on this journey to the dawn of creation, I want to take some time to talk about the Hebrew Scriptures, and particularly the first 5 books, or the Pentateuch. And hopefully this will set the stage for all of the episodes in the series as we consider the historical context, the theological content, and the relevance for today. These are sometimes referred to as the historical, theological, and inspirational approaches. This episode will serve merely as an introduction to the text, and we'll actually start reading it in the next installment. And so let us begin by looking at where Genesis sits within the Bible and define a few terms. While Christians refer to the first section of the Bible as the Old Testament, I believe it's important to acknowledge that this is a sacred text for the Jewish people, and existed as such for many generations before the New Testament was compiled and added. So I will also refer to it as the Hebrew Scriptures. And while most of the writings were indeed in Hebrew, at some point in the 3rd century BC, it was translated into Greek and some more texts were added. And this version is known as the Septuagint. This won't be so important right now, but by the time of Jesus, many of the Jews living under Roman rule were using the Greek version of the Scriptures, and it is often quoted in the Gospels and in the letters of Paul. It also included some books that today are not included in most Protestant Bibles or in the Hebrew Scriptures. But those would have been known to the 1st century Jews and are still used by Catholics. But before I go too far off on a tangent, let's take a brief look at these Hebrew Scriptures. There are a lot of books, 39, excluding the 7 deuterocanonical books that I mentioned. And these include many genres. There are various types of narrative writings, including mythic, patriarchal or ancestor history, prophecy, morality tales, and apocalyptic texts. There's also law, poetry, songs, and proverbs. Each type can be approached in different ways, and there is often overlap, especially in the themes that can be found. We'll be talking about these as we discuss the various books. But let's talk about a few more terms. You heard me say Pentateuch, which is another Greek word, and this means a 5-part writing. And this includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we'll start with this group of books as we look at them from a historical lens. You may also be familiar with the word Torah, which means law, teaching, or instruction, and holds a very special place in Jewish tradition and refers to these writings as well. Now there's an ancient tradition that holds that Moses himself was the author of these 5 books, although that is not very widely held in the literal sense today. When we think of the law coming to Moses from God and him bringing it to the people, then yes, Moses can be seen as the author, or at least the one who repeated what God taught him. We would say that the entirety of the law came as the direct revelation from God to Moses on Mount Sinai, and perhaps continued throughout his life. But as far as writing all 5 books, their narratives and legal procedures, is much more likely the work of many authors or editors over a longer period of time. So, who were they? We don't know their names because the Torah, or law, has been handed down for centuries as the work of Moses. But there are clues throughout the text that indicate that different schools or traditions played a big role in the textual and thematic composition of the writing itself. Such in-depth studies looking at the source of the writings became popular in the 17th and 18th centuries, and most scholars agree that there were about 4 sources that the biblical authors drew from. While distinctions in the sources are not always noticeable in English translations of the Bible, clues such as syntax, themes, titles used for God, or retelling of the same story point to multiple source materials. I won't go into all the details beyond this, but I do believe it's important to recognize as we start studying the Bible and certain questions come up. I also think it's important to address the big question that usually comes up if this is your first time hearing about source criticism. And if it is, I can assure you that your rabbi, minister, or priest has almost certainly studied this if you want a second opinion. So what's the big question that this brings up?
What about God?
Precisely. If there are multiple authors, or one editor was pulling from a bunch of sources, where does that leave God and inspiration? That brings us to the theological context. For me, it speaks to the amazing work of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God. Imagine a people telling these stories for generations around their campfires or before their altars, before it is ever written down. This is the sacred and familial epic of their people. This is the law that shows that they belong to the one God. The Israelite priests and scribes write down these laws and narratives. They study and teach them. But eventually they decide that it should be all compiled as one heroic story. God has been inspiring these stories from the very beginning and being present to his people every step of the way. The breath of God that gave Adam life, the promise to Abraham, the call of Moses, continued to speak to the authors that finally penned what would become the Torah. It was the divine promise that made sure that these final words were words that were meant to stand the test of time. And God did so in partnership with his people, the very people he had entered into covenant with. To me, that's an amazing story of God's work. But we each have our own traditions and what makes the most sense to us. When we continue to look at the theology present in the Pentateuch, what are some central themes that we will see played out? I think the first and most obvious is that God created a world that is good, and he blesses humanity. Historically, not all theologians will always agree on this point, but I think it's spelled out pretty clearly in the text. However, it is also clear that people have a tendency to sin, but God is there to deliver them and fulfill his promise, even if his people do not. The law is also very central in these books, which comes out of a covenant with Israel. This is the idea that there's a unique bond between God and his people, and following the law is the way in which the people show their uniqueness and blessedness in the world. We also see that ultimately, God is the God of history and is very much involved in human events. There are, of course, more themes that we will see as we look deeper into the texts themselves. And this brings us to the book of Genesis. The title of the book, as we know it in English, is actually Greek. And the word Genesis is where we get words like generation, for it means to generate or create. But the Hebrew word for this book is simply taken from the first words of the narrative, which is one word in Hebrew, Bereshit, in the beginning. This is not only the story of creation of the world, but the creation of a people chosen by God. When talking about the genre of Genesis, it is certainly a narrative piece, but divided into two parts. The first, chapters 1 through 11, would technically be considered mythology or primeval history. This is not to say that it is not true, but rather that it follows a certain pattern of writing used by many cultures to tell similar stories of creation and the human interaction with the divine. It is not meant to be historically accurate in the literal sense. It is not as concerned with a specific time or place or culture, but in a time before history and has a more supernatural setting. This can be seen in contrast to the ancestral history in chapters 12 through 50, which ground us in a particular historical time and place and a cultural way of life. The connection that weaves these stories together is the presence and relationship with a God who is very much involved with his people. It is important to note that the first 11 chapters set up certain key themes that will continue to be visited throughout not only Genesis, but the rest of the Bible. Creation is good, and God has a plan. Humans are also good, being the height of creation, but they are also prone to doing bad things. God continuously brings people back, and while he does chastise and punish them at times, he gives them numerous chances to come back and reestablish their relationship. This pattern kind of sums up the entire Bible. And so Genesis also introduces some key figures in chapters 12 through the end of the book, and begin to tell the tale of their special relationship with God, and particularly the family of Abraham. The pattern that seems to follow in these relationships is a promise that God makes with them that involves their offspring and the land. Descendants and land, which when you think about it, are really one way in which human beings understand their own dignity and, in a sense, immortality. In the beginning, we are told that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. Throughout the rest of Genesis, God shows them that they are, not only as individuals, but also as a people. They will inherit the land, a place to live in and cultivate, and their family will continue for countless generations. And in doing so, God will guide them, walk with them, and in turn, their identity will be associated with God. This is why names are so important, particularly when the names are given or changed by God, to better illustrate their relationship to both the divine and other human beings. So what are some of these names? Abraham, as I mentioned, meaning the father of a host of nations. His wife Sarah, whose name means princess. And then we have Isaac, whose story in some ways becomes eclipsed by his wife Rebekah, who plays a very important role in the family history. And this involves their sons Jacob and Esau and some dynamic sibling rivalry. Then we come to Jacob's story, which plays out like a soap opera, or perhaps like a Hallmark Channel romance, as he courts one of Laban's daughters, but ends up with the other daughter. Eventually, he marries both. Remember, this is a time before laws against polygamy, and a lot of drama continues, which we will get to as when we read these chapters. They end up with 12 sons, and God gives Jacob the name Israel, which is where we get the 12 tribes of Israel. These 12 brothers also have a lot of drama, which leads to the story of Joseph and his dreams, his fights with his brothers, and they all end up in Egypt. So Genesis ends up with a bit of a cliffhanger, and we are set up for the book of Exodus. So when and where does all this take place? Well, once we get to the stories of Abraham and his descendants, I mentioned that these stories take on a more historical than mythic setting. Based on archaeology, cultural customs, geographical names, and history of migration, and Egyptian history, most biblical scholars would agree that their journeys took them from Mesopotamia to Canaan to Egypt sometime between 1800 and 2100 BC. After this time, major settlements began to rise in this part of the world, and in particular, the strength of Egypt begins to make itself known. So, there's a bit of history to get us grounded before we begin to read these amazing accounts. While we'll still talk about the historical perspective and worldview from which these stories were written, the remaining episodes on Genesis will continue to look at all three approaches. How are these stories understood when they were written so long ago, and what do they have to say to us today? I hope you'll join me next time as we begin reading the first book of the Bible. Until then, God bless and do good.